The Galactic Confederacy had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They were tall beings with 4 arms and large amber eyes that could see in spectrums humans could not imagine. Their scientists had mapped galaxies. Their scholars had studied 40 million languages from across the known universe. Their computers could solve problems in seconds that would take other species centuries to understand. But one thing had defeated them completely. On 100 dead worlds scattered across the galaxy, there stood black stone monuments. Each monument was covered with the same 17 symbols, carved deep into rock that had survived longer than most stars. The Valanthi called it the precursor script, and for 800 years, their greatest minds had tried to understand what it meant. They had failed. Every single one of them, High Scholar Valanis, stood in the central archive on the planet Thesor Prime, staring at a piece of black stone that contained those mysterious symbols. She had spent 60 years of her life studying these markings. She had written 300 papers about them. She had developed new methods of analysis that had helped decode dozens of other ancient languages. None of it had helped with this one. Her assistant Corin entered the chamber quietly. He was young, by Valanthi standards, barely 200 years old, and he still had hope in his eyes. Valanis had lost that hope long ago. The Linguistic Council has made their decision, Corin said. They are considering closing the project permanently. Valanis did not respond. She kept staring at the symbols, as if somehow this time they might reveal their secrets. They did not. 800 years, she said finally. 800 years of the finest minds in the Confederacy. And we are no closer to understanding than we were on the first day. Perhaps some things are meant to remain unknown. No, Valanis turned to face her assistant. The beings who carved these symbols wanted to be understood. Why else would they place the same message on 100 different worlds? Why else would they carve it in stone meant to last forever? They wanted someone to read their words. They wanted someone to know what they had to say. She walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, a civilization had risen and fallen. They had built wonders and touched the heavens. And then they had died, leaving behind nothing but stone and silence and 17 symbols that no one could read. There is one option we have not tried, Valanis said slowly, which is the humans. Corin made a sound that his translation device converted to surprised disbelief. The humans. High Scholar, they are barely out of their infancy as a species. They have only been traveling between stars for 300 years. They have encountered fewer than 50 alien species. What could they possibly offer that we have not already tried? I do not know, Valanis admitted. But we have tried everything else. Perhaps fresh eyes might see what ancient ones cannot. She gave the order that same day. A message was sent across the galaxy to the small blue planet called Earth, asking for a human expert in dead languages. The humans were confused by the request. The United Nations Xenolinguistic Division spent 2 weeks trying to figure out if it was some kind of joke or trap. The Valanthi were one of the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy. Why would they need help from humans? But refusing would be an insult, and humans were still new to galactic politics. They could not afford to make enemies, so they began looking for someone to send. The problem was finding someone who was qualified. Human linguistics was focused on human languages. They had only begun to study alien communication systems. Most of their experts were busy with more immediate concerns. Eventually, a recruitment officer found himself in the small town of Helena, Montana, standing outside a community college that had seen better days. He walked through hallways that smelled of old carpet and cheap coffee until he found a cramped office filled with books and papers. Inside sat Samuel Briggs. He was 53 years old. With gray hair cut short and a face that had seen too much sun and too many hard days, he had been a Marine for 20 years, fighting in wars across half a dozen planets. Now he taught Latin and Greek to students who mostly did not care about either subject. "Let me make sure I understand," Samuel said after the officer explained the situation. "Some aliens who have been studying this writing for 800 years want me to come look at it?" "That is correct. And I am qualified for this because I teach dead languages. You are the closest thing we have to an expert who is willing to travel." Samuel laughed. It was a deep sound, rough around the edges. "Son, I teach teenagers how to conjugate verbs in languages that nobody has spoken for 2,000 years. I am not exactly a genius. The position includes significant hazard pay and an improved pension. Samuel looked around his office. The ceiling had water stains. The computer on his desk crashed at least twice a week. His students thought Latin was a type of music. "When do I leave?" he asked. The journey to this or prime took 11 days. Samuel spent most of that time reading everything the Valanthi had written about the precursor script. There was a lot of it. 800 years of scholarship filled thousands of files. He read about the mathematical approaches they had tried. He read about the linguistic analysis and the pattern recognition and the cognitive modeling. He read about the theories that had been proposed and tested and thrown away by the time his ship arrived at Thesser Prime. Samuel had come to a conclusion. The Valanthi were looking at this all wrong. High scholar Valanus met him at the archive. She was much taller than he had expected, nearly 3 feet higher than him. With 4 arms that moved in patterns his brain struggled to follow. "You have reviewed our research," she said. It was not a question. "I have. And what is your assessment?" Samuel looked up at the massive black monument that stood in the center of the archive. It was 20 meters tall, smooth as glass, covered with those 17 symbols that had defeated the greatest minds in the galaxy. "You have been approaching this problem from the wrong direction," he said. Every Valanthi in the chamber stopped what they were doing. They stared at the small human who had just dismissed 8 centuries of their work. "Explain," Valanus said. Her voice was cold. Samuel walked toward the monument, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have been treating this as a language, looking for grammar and syntax and meaning the way you would with any other writing system. That is the standard approach. For living languages, yes. Even for dead languages that have some connection to living ones." Samuel touched one of the symbols, a spiraling shape that looked like a galaxy. "But you have no context here. No reference point. No way to connect these symbols to anything you already know. That is precisely the problem. No, that is the symptom." Samuel turned to face her. "The problem is that you are assuming this is a language at all." The silence in the chamber was complete. "If it is not a language," Valanus said slowly, "then what is it?" Samuel looked back at the ancient symbols, carved by beings who had died before the Valanthi civilization was born. "That," he said, "is what we need to figure out." Samuel spent his first week on Thesser Prime simply watching. He watched the Valanthi scholars work. He watched them run the symbols through their translation programs. He watched them argue about theories and test hypotheses and shake their heads in frustration when nothing worked. And he thought about what he saw. The Valanthi were brilliant. There was no question about that. Their minds worked in ways that humans could barely understand. They could hold dozens of ideas at once, see patterns that would take human computers years to find, and remember everything they had ever learned with perfect clarity. But they had a weakness. They were too smart. Samuel had seen this before, in a different context. During his years as a Marine, he had worked with military intelligence officers who had all the information in the world, could not figure out what the enemy was going to do next. They would analyze and theorize and build complex models. And then some sergeant with 20 years of experience would walk in, look at the situation, and say something simple that cut through all the confusion. The Valanthi had been looking at the precursor script for so long that they could not see it anymore. They saw data and patterns and linguistic structures. They did not see what was actually in front of them. "Tell me about the monuments," Samuel said to Valanus one morning. They were in her private study, a room filled with artifacts from 100 worlds. She sat behind a desk made of some dark wood that Samuel did not recognize. Her 4 hands folded in a gesture that his translation implant identified as thoughtful attention. "What do you wish to know?" "Where are they? How are they distributed?" Valanus activated a holographic display. A map of the galaxy appeared with small dots marking each location where a precursor monument had been found. 112 confirmed sites, she said. They span approximately 40,000 light-years. Concentrated primarily in what you humans call the Cygnus Expanse and extending outward toward Confederate space. Samuel studied the map. The distribution was not random. He had spent too many years reading tactical maps to miss that. They form a line, he said. A curve, technically. But yes, there is a linear pattern to their placement. Not just a line. A perimeter. Samuel traced the shape with his finger. Look at the spacing. Look at Ho. W. They arc around this region here. He pointed to an empty area in the Cygnus expanse. This is a defensive formation. Balanis leaned forward. A defensive formation. I was a soldier for 20 years. I know what a fallback position looks like. Whoever placed these monuments was not exploring. They were retreating. They were pulling back from something, leaving markers as they went. We have considered the possibility that the precursors faced some kind of threat, but we found no evidence of conflict at any of the sites. That is because you were looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Samuel turned away from the map. You were looking for battle damage, weapons, signs of war. But what if the threat was not something you could fight? What do you mean? Samuel did not answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the alien sky. 2 moons hung on the horizon, one red and one pale blue. So different from Earth, and yet the stars beyond were the same stars he had seen from Montana. When I was young, he said, my grandfather told me stories about his grandfather, who had lived through a great sickness. Millions of people died. Not from war, not from violence. From a disease they could not see and did not understand, turned back to face Valanis. My great-great-grandfather survived. And do you know what he did afterward? He wrote letters. Dozens of letters to people he would never meet, describing what had happened, explaining what they had learned about the sickness, warning them what to do if it ever came back. He was trying to protect future generations. Yes, and he knew he might fail. He knew the letters might be lost or destroyed or simply ignored, but he wrote them anyway, because it was the only thing he could do.
Samuel gestured at the holographic map.
These monuments are letters. They are messages from beings who knew they were dying, left for strangers they would never meet, hoping someone would read them and understand. Valanis was silent for a long moment. Her amber eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the study. If you are correct, she said finally, then we have been asking the wrong question all along. What question have you been asking? What do these symbols mean? What language do they represent? How can we translate them? Valanis stood and walked to the map. But if they are a warning, the question we should ask is different. What are they warning us about? Samuel said yes. They worked together for the next several days, approaching the problem from a new direction. Instead of trying to decode the symbols, they tried to understand the beings who had made them. The precursors had built monuments designed to last millions of years. They had placed them on 100 worlds, spread across a vast distance. They had chosen locations carefully, always in places where the monuments would be visible, where future travelers could not miss them. These were not the actions of scholars writing a research paper. These were the actions of desperate people trying to be heard. Look at this symbol, Samuel said, pointing to a shape that appeared more frequently than any other. It looked like a hand with 5 fingers raised with the palm facing outward. What does this remind you of? We have analyzed it extensively. It does not correspond to any known phoneme or concept in our databases. Forget your databases. Just look at it. What does it look like? Valanis studied the symbol. It resembles an appendage of some kind. Perhaps a manipulator limb, a hand, Samuel said. It looks like a hand. And what does a hand raised like this mean in almost every culture I have ever studied? He raised his own hand, palm out, fingers spread. Stop, Valanis said slowly. It means stop, or warning, or danger, or do not proceed. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the room. This is not a letter in an alphabet. It is a gesture, a universal signal that any being with hands might recognize. But why would they? Because they were afraid. Because they wanted to warn whoever found these monuments. Because they knew that words might not translate. Languages might not survive. Cultures might be too different to understand each other. But this. He held up his hand again. This might get through. Valana stared at the symbol for a long moment. Then she began to move through the database, pulling up images of the other 16 symbols, arranging them in new patterns. If the first symbol is a gesture meaning stop, she said, then perhaps the others are gestures as well. That is what I am thinking. They worked through the night, examining each symbol through this new lens. Some were harder to interpret than others, but gradually a pattern began to emerge, a spiral that evoked a sensation of falling or being pulled downward, circles expanding outward like an explosion, a shape like a closing eye, suggesting darkness or endings. And again, that hand raised in warning. By morning, they had a rough translation. Not of words, but of feelings. Not of language, but of fear. Something terrible had happened to the precursors. Something they could not fight and could not escape. And they had spent their final days carving these warnings into stone, hoping that someone, someday, would understand. "We need to tell the council," Valana said. Samuel nodded. But he could not shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface. The precursors had left a message, yes, but the most important part of that message was still hidden. What had they been warning about? And was it still out there? The discovery changed everything. Within days, scholars from across the Confederacy began arriving at Thesser Prime. They came from a dozen different species, bringing their own perspectives and their own expertise. The archive, which had been quiet for so long, suddenly buzzed with activity and excitement. Samuel found himself at the center of it all, which was not a position he had ever expected to be in. He was just a retired Marine who taught Latin to bored teenagers. He had no business standing in rooms full of beings who had been studying languages since before humans learned to write. But they listened to him anyway because he had seen something they had missed. The key is perspective, he explained to a group of scholars one afternoon. You have been looking at these symbols as individual units, like letters in an alphabet. But they are not meant to be read that way. He activated the holographic display, showing the locations of all 112 monuments spread across the galaxy. Each monument has the same 17 symbols, but they are arranged differently. For 800 years, you assumed these arrangements were variations in the message, like different sentences using the same words. That was a logical assumption, one of the scholars said. She was a being called a Nethrin, with 6 eyes and skin that changed color with her emotions. Right now it was deep blue, indicating intense concentration. It's logical but wrong. Samuel manipulated the display, and the view changed. Instead of showing the monuments as dots on a map, it now showed the symbols themselves, positioned according to their placement on each monument. What if the arrangements are not variations in a message? What if they are parts of a larger whole? He brought the symbols together, overlapping them according to their positions across all 112 sites. The hologram shifted and reformed, and suddenly the scholars could see something new. The symbols formed a structure, a 3-dimensional pattern of incredible complexity that extended through multiple dimensions. "By the ancestors," the Nethrin whispered. Her skin had turned pure white, a color Samuel had learned to indicate a shock. "It is a map," Valana said. She stepped forward, her 4 hands moving rapidly as she manipulated the display. "Look here. This section corresponds to the position of the galactic core. And this pattern matches the orbital mechanics of a binary star system in the Cygnus region." Not just a map, Samuel added. A reference frame. They encoded information about the fundamental structure of the universe. The speed of light, the gravitational constant. Mathematical relationships that any spacefaring civilization could verify independently. They were establishing common ground, another scholar said, proving that they understood the same reality we do. Exactly. Samuel highlighted a portion of the structure that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. And once you have that common ground, you can build on it. You can communicate things that words alone could never express. For the next 2 weeks, teams of scholars worked around the clock to decode the structure. They mapped its dimensions and traced its patterns. They found layer after layer of meaning hidden within the geometric forms. The precursors, it turned out, had been even more clever than anyone had imagined. They had not just left a warning. They had left a complete record of their civilization, their science, their history, their understanding of the universe, all encoded in a form that did not require language. That would remain meaningful no matter how much time passed or how different the beings who found it might be. But at the heart of the structure was something else. Something darker. Samuel found it on the 18th day, late at night, when most of the other scholars had gone to rest. He had been staring at the hologram for hours, following patterns that seemed to lead somewhere important, and then he saw it, hidden within the geometric beauty of the precursor message was a set of coordinates, specific, precise, pointing to a location deep in the Cygnus expanse. In the empty region that the monuments seemed to be retreating from, Valanis, he called. You need to see this. She arrived within minutes, still dressed in what passed for sleep. In clothes among her species. When she saw what he had found, her amber eyes went wide. They marked a location, she said. Not just any location. Samuel pulled up the tactical map he had been studying earlier. The one that showed the monument positions as a defensive perimeter. Look at how the monuments are arranged. They form a curve around this point. They were not just retreating. They were retreating from something specific. The origin of the threat. Whatever destroyed them came from here. Samuel felt cold despite the warmth of the room, and they wanted us to know exactly where it is. Valanis was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. We need to tell the council. I know. They will want to investigate. I know that too. Samuel. She used his name for the first time, and he looked up to meet her eyes. The precursors were more advanced than us. They had technologies we can barely imagine. And whatever's at those coordinates destroyed them completely. We have found no trace of their civilization except these monuments. Nothing else survived, I understand. Do you? Because I am afraid that some of my colleagues will not understand. They will see an opportunity for discovery. They will want to go there to see what the precursors feared, to learn from whatever they find. Samuel thought about his years as a soldier, about the times he had seen people make decisions based on hope instead of wisdom, about the graves he had visited, belonging to friends who had taken one risk to many. The precursors did not build these monuments just to mark a location, he said. They built them to warn us away. Every symbol, every pattern, every piece of this message says the same thing. Danger, stop, do not proceed. Yes, then we need to make sure the council understands that. He stood and stretched his tired muscles. We need to make them see what I saw. Not data, not an academic puzzle. A warning from people who knew they were dying left for strangers they would never meet. How do you propose we do that? Samuel smiled, though there was no humor in it. I have spent 20 years learning how to make people listen. In the Marines, we called it leadership. In teaching, we call it communication. Either way, it comes down to the same thing, which is telling the truth in a way that people cannot ignore. He looked back at the hologram, at the coordinates pointing to something that had ended a civilization and might be waiting still. Tomorrow, he said, I am going to tell the council a story, and I am going to make sure they understand every word. Valanis nodded slowly. I will arrange for you to speak. Thank you. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Samuel, why do you care so much about this? You are human. You have only known about the wider galaxy for a few centuries. Whatever destroyed the precursors happened long before your species even existed. Why does it matter to you? Samuel considered the question. It was a fair one, because someone has to, he said finally. Because those beings out there, whoever they were, spent their final days trying to save strangers they would never meet. They did not know who would find their monuments. They did not know if anyone ever would. But they tried anyway, because it was the right thing to do. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death and still believed in something. I am not going to let their sacrifice mean nothing. Someone has to listen. Someone has to care. And right now, that someone is me. Valanis did not respond, but as she left, Samuel thought he saw something in her expression that he recognized. Hope. After 800 years of failure, the Volanthi had finally found hope. He just prayed they would not waste it. The council chamber was the largest, enclosed space Samuel had ever seen. It rose hundreds of meters above him, carved from living rock that had been shaped over thousands of years. Seating tiers circled the central speaking floor, filled with representatives from 17 different species. Hundreds of eyes, in every shape and color imaginable, looked down at him. Samuel had faced enemy fire. He had led men into battle. He had stood at the bedsides of dying friends and kept his composure. But standing alone in the center of that vast chamber, knowing that his words might shape the future of the galaxy, was something different entirely. He took a deep breath and began. 3 weeks ago, I was a retired Marine teaching Latin to college freshmen in Montana. I had never been off Earth. I had never met an alien. I had no idea why anyone would want my help with anything. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Samuel had their attention. High Scholar Valanis asked me to look at the precursor script because humans have experience with dead languages. Languages that no one speaks anymore. Languages that we have to piece together from fragments and guesses and educated assumptions. He walked slowly across the speaking floor, making eye contact with as many representatives as he could. Your scholars have spent 800 years trying to decode these symbols. They have used every tool at their disposal. Mathematical analysis, linguistic modeling, cognitive mapping. All of it failed. We are aware of our failures, a deep voice said from the upper tiers. The speaker was a massive being covered in thick fur, with tusks curving from his lower jaw. Samuel's implant identified him as Ambassador Vorith of the Gathrin Federation. Why have you come to remind us of them? Because I want to explain why you failed. And it has nothing to do with intelligence or technology or the limits of your methods. Samuel stopped in the center of the floor and raised his hand. Palm outward, fingers spread. You failed because you were looking for a language. But this is not a language. It is a gesture. He held the pose, letting them look at it. On Earth, this gesture means stop. It means warning. It means danger ahead. We use it to tell people to stay back, to be careful, to pay attention. And it is one of the oldest symbols in human history. He lowered his hand. The precursors did not write words. They wrote gestures. Universal signals that any being with manipulator appendages might recognize. They did this because they knew that words would not survive. Languages change. Cultures evolve. What makes sense to one species might be incomprehensible to another, but gestures are different. The raised hand means stop because it creates a barrier. The closed eye means darkness because eyes close in the dark. The expanding circles mean explosion because that is how explosions look. These are not arbitrary symbols. They are pictures of reality, activated the holographic display, and the three-dimensional structure they had discovered appeared above his head. When we combined the symbols from all 112 monument sites, we found this: a map of the universe, a description of physical constants, a reference frame that any spacefaring civilization could verify independently. The scholars in the audience leaned forward. Many of them had seen this data already, but seeing it presented this way was different. The precursors built common ground. They proved that they understood the same reality we do. And then they used that common ground to tell us something important. Samuel manipulated the display, and the coordinates appeared, glowing red against the darkness. This is the center of the pattern. The point that all the monuments are retreating from. The precursors wanted us to know exactly where this place is. What is there? Someone asked. We do not know. But we know what it did. Samuel's voice grew quieter, and the chamber fell silent to hear him. The precursors were advanced, more advanced than any of us. They built monuments that have lasted millions of years. They encoded messages in geometries that span dimensions we cannot perceive. They had knowledge and technology beyond anything we can imagine, and something destroyed them, completely, absolutely. We have found no trace of their civilization except these warnings carved in stone. No cities, no ships, no bodies, nothing. He let that sink in. Whatever is at these coordinates did not just defeat the precursors. It erased them. It took a civilization that spanned half the galaxy and reduced it to silence. And the precursors, in their final days, used everything they had to leave us this message. The display changed again, showing the emotional translation they had developed. Not words, but feelings. Fear, warning, desperation, love. They were afraid, Samuel said. They were dying. And they spent their last moments trying to save strangers they would never meet. People from species that did not yet exist. Beings who might not be born for millions of years. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. That is what these monuments mean. They are not a puzzle to be solved. They are not a mystery to be investigated. They are a warning from the dead, left by beings who loved the universe so much that they could not bear to leave it unprotected. He looked up at the assembled representatives. You have to decide what to do with this information. You can ignore it. You can investigate those coordinates and try to learn what destroyed the precursors. You can treat this as an academic curiosity or a potential source of valuable technology. But before you decide, I want you to think about something. The precursors were smarter than us. They were more advanced than us. They had resources and knowledge that we cannot match. And they did not try to fight whatever destroyed them. They did not try to study it, or understand it, or use it. They ran. They carved their warnings into stone, and they died. Samuel let the silence stretch out. Then he spoke one more time. I am just a retired Marine who teaches dead languages. I do not have the wisdom of 800 years of scholarship. I do not have the intelligence of beings who have mapped the universe. But I know one thing. When someone spends their dying breath trying to warn you about something, you should listen. He stepped back from the center of the floor. That is all I have to say. The chamber erupted into noise. Representatives shouted questions and arguments and demands. Some wanted to send expeditions immediately. Others wanted to build defenses. A few argued that the whole thing was a misinterpretation and that more study was needed. Samuel ignored it all. He walked to the edge of the speaking floor, where Valanis was waiting. You did well, she said. Did I? They seem pretty divided. They are. But that is better than unified ignorance. She guided him toward a side exit. The debate will continue for days, perhaps weeks. But you have given them something they did not have before. What is that? Perspective. She looked back at the chaos of the chamber. For 800 years, the precursor script was a puzzle. A challenge to be solved. You have reminded them that it is something else entirely. A responsibility. They walked in silence through the corridors of the archive. Samuel felt exhausted, drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He had said everything he could say. Now it was up to others to decide what to do with it. What happens now? He asked. Now we wait. The council will debate. Eventually, they will reach a decision. And what do you think they will decide? Valanis was quiet for a long moment. I think they will be careful, she said finally. Your words reached them. Even the ones who want to investigate will do so cautiously. They will not rush blindly into danger. I hope you are right. So do I. She stopped at a junction in the corridor. You should rest, Samuel. You have done everything you can. He nodded and turned toward his quarters. But something made him stop and look back. Valanis, the precursors. Do you think they would be satisfied? With what we have done? With how we have listened? She considered the question carefully. I think, she said slowly, that they would be grateful. They sent a message across millions of years hoping someone would hear it. And you heard it, Samuel. A human from a species so young that the universe barely knows you exist. She smiled, an expression that looked strange on her alien features but somehow felt warm. I think they would say that their sacrifice was worthwhile, Samuel nodded. He hoped she was right. He really hoped she was right. The debate lasted for 3 weeks. Samuel watched from the visitors' gallery as representatives argued about the fate of the galaxy. Some spoke for hours, presenting detailed plans for investigation or defense. Others were brief, simply stating their position and sitting down. The translation implant in his ear worked constantly, converting a dozen alien languages into words he could understand. The arguments fell into familiar patterns. There were those who wanted to know more, who could not resist the lure of discovery. There were those who wanted to hide, to pretend the threat did not exist. And there were those who wanted to prepare, to take the warning seriously without letting fear paralyze them. Samuel recognized these patterns. He had seen them in military briefings, in academic debates, in small-town council meetings. The scale was different, but the dynamics were the same. People were people, no matter how many arms they had or what color their skin was. On the 15th day, Ambassador Vorith of the Gathern Federation approached him during a recess. "You have been quiet," the massive alien said. His voice was deep enough to make Samuel's chest vibrate. "I said everything I had to say, perhaps. But you have an opinion about how this debate is going." Samuel looked at the ambassador. Despite his intimidating appearance, there was intelligence in those small eyes, and something that might have been respect. "I think you are all missing the point," Samuel said. "Oh, enlighten me." "The precursors did not leave their warning because they expected us to run away. They did not carve monuments on 100 worlds just to tell us to be afraid. Then what did they want?" Samuel gestured at the chamber, at the arguing representatives, at the whole chaotic mess of galactic politics. They wanted us to prepare, to have time, to face whatever destroyed them, not in ignorance, but with knowledge. He met the ambassador's eyes. The warning was not the end of their message. It was the beginning. Forrest studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You are wiser than your years, human. I am 53. That is not young by human standards. By Gathran standards, you are barely an infant." The ambassador's tusked mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "But wisdom is not measured in years. It is measured in understanding. And you understand something that many of my colleagues do not. That fear is only useful if it leads to action. Otherwise, it is just another way of dying." The ambassador walked away, leaving Samuel to think about what he had said. On the 21st day, the council reached its decision. They would not approach the coordinates. Not yet. The risk was too great, the unknown too vast. Instead, they would establish a network of monitoring stations, watching the Cygnus expanse for any sign of activity. They would share the precursor warning with every species in the Confederacy. They would begin building defenses, developing contingencies, preparing for a threat that might come tomorrow or might come in 1,000 years. But most importantly, they would remember. The precursor script would no longer be classified as an unsolved puzzle. It would be recognized as what it truly was, a sacred trust, a message from the dead entrusted to the living, a responsibility that every generation would carry forward. Hi, Scholar Valanis, delivered the council's decision in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy. She spoke of the precursors with reverence, acknowledging their sacrifice and their wisdom. She spoke of the threat that had destroyed them, and the need for vigilance and preparation. And she spoke of Samuel Briggs. This human came to us from a young species, barely 3 centuries into their journey among the stars. He had no special qualifications, no advanced degrees, no centuries of scholarly experience. He was simply a soldier who had learned to read dead languages, and yet he saw what we could not see. He understood what we could not understand. He listened to voices that had been silent for millions of years, and he heard what they were trying to say. The precursors did not leave their message for the wise or the powerful. They left it for anyone who would listen. And it was a human who listened first. Samuel felt his face grow warm as the gallery turned to look at him. He had never been comfortable with attention, but Valanis was not finished. This is what humans bring to our galaxy. Not wisdom accumulated over millennia. Not technology refined over countless generations. They bring fresh eyes and open hearts. They bring the willingness to see what is actually there, rather than what they expect to find. They are young and foolish, and they make mistakes. But they also learn, they grow. They surprise us. The precursors were ancient and powerful, and they fell. We must not make their mistake. We must not become so confident in our own understanding that we cannot hear the truth when it is spoken by someone different from ourselves. Today we begin a new chapter. Not because we have decoded an ancient script, but because we have remembered how to listen. The ceremony ended. The representatives dispersed, and Samuel Briggs, retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant, found himself alone in the visitors' gallery. Looking up at the stars through the transparent ceiling, he thought about the precursors, about beings who had lived and loved and built wonders, only to face something they could not defeat. He thought about their final days, carving warnings into stone, hoping against hope that someone would understand. And he thought about how strange it was that he, of all people, had been the one to hear them. The universe, he had learned, had a peculiar sense of humor. 2 months later, Samuel returned to Earth. He went back to his community college, back to his cramped office with its water-stained ceiling and unreliable computer. He resumed teaching Latin and Greek to students. He still did not care much about either subject, but something had changed. Sometimes, late at night, when he was grading papers or preparing lessons, he would look up at the sky and think about what was out there. The monitoring stations watching the Cygnus expanse, the defenses being built across 100 worlds, the species that had once been strangers, now united by a common purpose. And somewhere, in the vast darkness between the stars, the monuments of the precursors still stood, silent, patient, waiting. Their message had been received. Their warning had been heard. After millions of years of silence, they had finally been understood. Samuel liked to think that they would be pleased. One evening, a student came to his office hours with a question. She was a young woman named Lucy, barely 19, with bright eyes and a genuine curiosity that was rare among his students. "Professor Briggs," she said, "why do you study dead languages? What is the point if no one speaks them anymore?" Samuel leaned back in his chair and considered the question. "Because the dead still have things to tell us," he said finally. "Because people who lived thousands of years ago had wisdom we need to hear. Because language is not just a tool for communication. It is a bridge across time." He looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Because someday we will be the dead. Someday, someone will find the things we leave behind and try to understand them. When that happens, I want them to succeed." Lucy nodded slowly. "That makes sense. I hope so." Samuel smiled. "Now, do you have questions about the assignment?" They talked for another hour about Latin grammar and Roman history and the strange persistence of dead languages across the centuries. When Lucy left, Samuel sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking. The precursors had sent their message across millions of years, hoping someone would listen. And someone had a retired Marine from Montana, teaching dead languages at a community college in the middle of nowhere. The universe had a sense of humor, all right. But it also had a kind of justice. The wise and powerful had failed. The young and foolish had succeeded. Not because they were smarter or better, but because they had been willing to listen. That was the lesson Samuel realized. The most important thing the precursors had taught them. Not the location of the threat, not the nature of the danger, but the simple, profound truth that every voice matters, even the quiet ones, even the forgotten ones, even the ones that speak from beyond the grave. Someone is always listening. He picked up his red pen and went back to grading papers. The stars would still be there tomorrow.